Brace yourself.
Saints Row 4 is a power fantasy. I think admitting this now is going to make any further analysis less jarring, so I'm being upfront for this one. It's, without question, a power fantasy, a rush of adrenaline that's built to make the player feel like a superhuman badass at every single opportunity. It threw the series' sense of restraint off a skyscraper, reaching a visceral apex that simply couldn't be compared to its predecessors anymore. Saints Row 4 is a power fantasy in its top form, one that never puts on the brakes. But like any power fantasy, Saints Row 4 has its hurdles to overcome. Giving the player the tools needed to feel like an all-powerful harbinger of endless chaos isn't without its obstacles. A game can run the risk of neutering progression, giving the player moves and abilities that lack utility, or a lack of situations where they can be used. It's not easy to provide power, but also keep the power from feeling trivial. Something has to be the limiter. There needs to be a wall to destroy. And at first glance, Saints Row 4 doesn't have any kind of wall. It's built to give the player so many moves and weapons that any kind of penalty becomes a triviality within an instant. It shamelessly empowers the player in the name of chaos, and that's admittedly a double-edged sword. So what can be done to give purpose to the player's limitations while still standing as a power fantasy? How can we keep the player from being too powerful while still giving them an indulgent avalanche of skills to use? As Saints Row 4 notes early on, being trapped in a virtual simulation that shamelessly satires the Matrix has its perks. The most obvious is reshaping code to perform superhuman feats of strength and stamina inside the simulation. The earliest abilities you obtain in Saints Row 4 are the super speed and super jump skills, which turn navigating the city of Steelport into an entirely different animal from almost any other open world games on the market. Superpowers and open world games are a match made in heaven, as Saints Row 4's obvious references to games like Prototype show. But it's an intelligent direction. Superpowers add both speed and verticality to the city of Steelport. Ascending tall buildings or speeding down highways is as effortless as it gets, and things only get better as upgrades like wall running and gliding chain these different abilities together in fluid and stylish ways. These upgrades are introduced unusually early. In fact, Saints Row 4 doesn't show much restraint at all in giving players new abilities and upgrades. Individual skills can be improved by finding data clusters which populate the map with such density that you'd be hard-pressed to find a single screen without at least one, even when further along in the game's story. The amount of collectible data clusters is heavily complemented by the movement mechanics. You can glide and leap with such seamlessness, every single movement element can be chained, so exploring Steelport for clusters rarely feels like a chore. The upgrades range from new types of attacks to higher stats, but they feed into the player's growth, accelerating progression while giving the player options. But Saints Row 4's lack of restraint definitely brings up a good point. The massive amount of skills and upgrades a player gets in such a short amount of time, it all borders on overkill, or in another term, indulgence. Saints Row 4 is a player-indulgent game, delivering so many new skills and moves that the player's toolbox can feel overfilled. But is this really a bad thing? Isn't more options an ultimately ideal point? One of my earliest occurrences with Saints Row 4 came long before any intense plot points came about. It was those first couple of powers, super speed and super jump. I immediately associated myself with the game's masterful motion mechanics. I was bulldozing enemies at Mach speeds and leaping up skyscrapers. Add in the gunplay and melee abilities, and almost any alien horde in Steelport could be dealt with very easily. But Saints Row 4 continued to deliver new powers and skills. Ice blasts, earth-shaking stomps, fire attacks, harder-hitting melee moves, it almost never ended. Barely into the game's first chapters, the player is equipped with an arsenal and skill set that would instantly destroy a villain in any other game. Because of this, the greatest enemy of such an enormous amount of options is a difficulty that can't balance it. When a player is too powerful, enemy battles can become trivial, and I do think that this is something Saints Row 4 doesn't entirely address. Considering how versatile the basic navigation moves are, even in combat, actual battles can become cakewalks, even on higher difficulties. So the issue comes from giving new abilities a sense of purpose, even when other earlier abilities can get the job done easily. Does Volition do this in Saints Row 4? I do think there's more to this than the whole power fantasy idea. I mean, yeah, as I said, Saints Row 4 is a power fantasy, and I'll still argue that it's a great one. But it takes a careful hand in making an essentially overclocked loadout of weapons and skills to satisfy the player, while also giving the loadout a sense of importance. Earlier I mentioned that the navigation mechanics had the versatility to be used in combat, as you can run over enemies at high speeds to disorient them. What's interesting is that the navigation mechanics aren't the only abilities that Volition made this way. Volition had the foresight to make almost every superpower versatile, so it can be used in various ways for multiple types of solutions. I love how the movement mechanics make exploring Steelport so free-flowing, but this level of fluidity wasn't reserved for the navigation mechanics alone. For example, entering a flashpoint to take out some aliens became an almost majestic occurrence, as using the Ice Blast to freeze enemies for some quick kills, or jettisoning down with a stomp attack became totally valid combat tactics. The offensive attacks have animations that gel responsively, so moving through individual combat zones is fast and snappy, letting the player chain navigation and combat into a stellar collective of action. There's a surprising level of elegance to how easy it is to not just move throughout Steelport, but also move toward and completing various challenges. Open world games have always had the problem of large spaces for exploration with neutered movement, and the looming thought that you're mindlessly checking things off of a checklist. Saints Row 4 obviously fixes the former problem with its superpowers, but I think it solves the second issue as well. There are a ton of collectibles in Steelport, but Volition went into this mindset conscientiously. There's a sense of fluidity when moving to a data cluster or a packed flashpoint, dropping from above with a well-timed stomp. There's a momentum that makes these small, bite-sized challenges into longer chains of engagement. With maxed out stamina or a fully upgraded weapon, these moments of checking boxes begin to feel less like busy work and more like a cohesive moment of flow. And I think that a power fantasy should try to attain this sense of flow. There shouldn't be a moment where the player has to stop and think. These moments are momentum killers, and in this case, player hostile. Saints Row 4's fast navigation, honed combat, and overall its sense of indulgence toward the player achieve an almost zen-like sense of chaos, where flow is achieved by simply overclocking the player's sense of progression, stamina, and destructive potential. And I think this is where many other open world games fail. They don't achieve that sense of flow. They mire their worlds with collectibles, but don't give the player the tools to make these collectibles easy or fun to get. Instead, worlds get bigger, the map icons more plentiful, and the downtime all the more prevalent. But Saints Row 4 subverts these weaknesses by giving the player not only an avalanche of skills and options, but a sense of freedom and limitlessness where these skills can be unleashed. Regardless of your battle tactics, Saints Row 4 wants you to feel satisfied with what you choose to do. It wants you to get lost in your own head and be the arbiter of chaos that Steelport needs. Even as a fan of Saints Row 4, one who's played it repeatedly across multiple platforms, it wasn't until my most recent playthrough where I realized what Volition did. The state of flow, the hypnotic sense of indulgence, it put me in a trance where I just wanted to keep playing. I do still have my issues with the way open world games have operated for years now, and with the current state of the industry, I don't think those problems will ever be fully solved. But Saints Row 4 acts as a refreshing glass of water, one so pure and confident in its ethos that it's difficult to pull myself away. As far as player-indulgent power fantasies go, Saints Row 4 remains the commander-in-chief.